Location determines wardrobe. We all know this. We all live our lives this way. Depending on where we're at, it kind of determines on what we're going to wear. So like, for example, it's perfectly acceptable if I'm at home and I'm wearing pajama pants, but probably not a good idea to wear pajama pants whenever I go and teach, right? Or if I were to go to a business meeting, wearing pajama pants doesn't actually make sense. Or another example, if you're going to the beach, makes sense to wear like a swimsuit there. Probably not a good idea to wear a swimsuit if you're gonna go like traversing through a mountain or if you're gonna go through like a forest, right? Because the location kind of determines the wardrobe. What we see in Genesis 37 through 40 is that Joseph is going to go through a change of multiple locations. He's essentially going to keep going down, 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 kind of further going down into a pit. So for example, in Genesis 37, he goes down into a well. As you know, he gets thrown into a well by his brothers. Later on, we'll see that he goes down to Egypt, and while they are in Potiphar's house, his tunic is going to get ripped off, and he's going to be falsely accused, and he's going to go down into the pit of the house, which is going to be the prison. So he goes down into the well, he goes down into prison, and of course we can say that he goes down into Egypt. Further and further, Joseph goes down. And every single location change, we also see a wardrobe change for Joseph. So when it comes to the well, his tunic that he got from his dad gets ripped off. This is kind of the one that's a rainbow colored tunic that was this prized possession gifted to him by his father, Jacob. His brothers ripped that off of him and then threw him into the well. Change of location, change of clothing. We see whenever he goes into the prison, he gets shabby clothing. These garments that are dirty. We'll see this brought up in chapter 40 and 41, that as he goes to the palace, he has to take off his dirty clothes and put on new clothes as he's about to be seeing Pharaoh, the king. So when he goes into the prison, of course, he gets shabby garments. And we know while he is in Egypt at Potiphar's house, his tunic there gets ripped off. Of course, it's not the same one from before, but this is going to be where Potiphar's wife snatches out after him. He runs away, and then she keeps the tunic and actually ends up using that tunic as a way to falsely accuse Joseph and get him thrown into prison. Location change brings change of clothing. But in the ancient world, it wasn't just something to put on different clothes. Matter of fact, clothing signified who you are. Clothing was all about status. And so in the same way that Joseph goes from a change of location and descends and descends and descends, in his changing of clothing, Joseph descends and descends in his status. He goes from being a beloved son, gifted something that very likely was going to be a reminder for him of his inheritance, this rainbow-colored tunic. He gets this removed from him, and then he lowers into the status of someone that is enslaved and lowers into the status of someone that is incarcerated, waiting just to be ultimately executed by Pharaoh. Change of clothing means change of status. It makes chapter 40 of Genesis that much more sorrowful. Here is this young man, this teenager not too long ago, who was talking about these dreams and kind of a bit of a tattletale, who has gone from being a beloved son to now being a falsely accused inmate. But what I want us to hear in the midst of all this doom and this gloom in this chapter is that God still sees Joseph in the same way. Although Joseph goes through a status change and a location change, he does not go through an identity change in God's perspective. Matter of fact, the text wants to iterate and reiterate over and over again that God was still with Joseph the entire time. He still saw him as a covenant person. He still saw him as part of the family of Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, and allowed him to flourish no matter what situation he found himself in. And so though he had a wardrobe change, though he had a location change, God saw him the same. But I think we have to stop and ask this question. Why is it that Joseph goes into these pit-like situations at all? And why is it that although he doesn't go through an identity change, Joseph certainly does go through a character change? He essentially grows up in every situation that he faces. He goes from being maybe a prideful tattletale in Genesis 37, kind of talking about these dreams that he's had and how people are going to bow to him. And again, he's young. We can kind of give him the benefit of the doubt here. But then he goes to being someone that is, wearing a tunic as a slave, but ends up being second in command of Potiphar's house. Yes, he goes to being an incarcerated person, but he ends up being in second in command of the entire prison house. He goes from being a tattletale to being someone with responsibility. And once again, we have to ask the question, why is it whenever Joseph, while in these pit-like situations, that is where God brings transformation? Here's one thing I want to make sure that we know, is that I don't think God delights in us being in pit-like situations. I don't think he delights in whenever his people are abused or misused or falsely accused. He doesn't delight in that. He doesn't delight in evil. He doesn't delight in sin. He doesn't cause sin to happen and then try to use that. But what he does do is that when sin comes its way, God, through his creativity, God, through his mighty strength, will utilize even the most garbage of situations to make a masterful art piece. God will use one of the most garbage situations to bring the redemption of his fallen world. We don't just see that in Joseph going down into the well and then into Egypt and then into the pits of the prison. We see Jesus do this. We see God do this himself. That he goes into the deepest pit imaginable, death itself, and through that brings transformation. And so as we read of this chapter of Joseph imprisoned, falsely incarcerated, we can begin to ask questions about God's justice. And I think the text allows us to do that. It wants us to do that. It also wants us to bring to mind our own pit-like situations, those moments where we feel like we are in the valley of the shadow of death, where we are going through the darkest of things. Whether it's in your past or in your present or in the future, we have or will be going through pits. We have or will be going through darkness. And we can recognize that. We can see the changing around us. We can see the social status changing. But at the end of the day, I want us to be asking, how is God bringing transformation in this moment in us? Because once again, God can use even the most dire and darkest of situations to do what he does best, and that is make us new.